Please return your interpretation equipment. Do not walk off with it. You will not get far because you don't have your credentials on. Please return the interpretation equipment.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes, chers délégués. On souhaitait vous informer que l'événement sur les autorités locales et la biodiversité, qui est organisé par le comité français de l'UICN, se tient dans la petite salle adjacente au pavillon et démarre tout de suite. Merci beaucoup.
this is better for me. Yeah. We have Joan, and we have Ursula, and we have you. Hi, and Jessica. Yes. Yes, come here. Do we need you? Do we need you? Please have a seat. We're just missing Joan and Ursula. Hello, hello. You can hear me? We're about to get started for the session on environmental defenders in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So if you're here for that event, please have a seat. We will start very shortly. Again, we're just about to start with the event, the side event on environmental defenders in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So if you're here for that event, please come and have a seat, and we will start very shortly.
Testing.
Do you think I need this?
You might. I don't know. It's up to you. I think if they're transmitting on Zoom, you have to use it anyway. Just because for those who aren't. Hola, hola. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Si nos siguen en Zoom.
We need another chair?
No. We're missing a chair. You can sit there and then you'll come up? Okay, perfect. Because then you, after your invocation, then you can trade with Jessica? Yeah? Perfect.
Why don't you just let me sit there then?
Oh, and you invocate from the beginning? Yeah. Oh, okay. So Jessica, come sit here because he needs to be right at the middle of the room. Yeah? So please.
And then I'll hand you this mic.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ramos, and I am the Deputy Chair of the IUCN Commission on Environment, Economic, and Social Policy. And it's with great pleasure that I'm here today. Well, maybe not such great pleasure because the topic of environmental defenders is not one of pleasure. But it is pleasurable to be here with a room of people who are trying to do things very differently and change the course of action in the world of conservation for indigenous peoples, local communities, and environmental defenders. Today we're very lucky because we have Uncle Sol with us from Hawaii. And Uncle Sol is going to start the session for us today with an invocation.
So, aloha kako. Is it still morning? No sun. I thought that would be nice to begin this panel discussion with an invocation that calls upon our ancestors and our families to be in our presence. So if you would like to join me, I'd like to ask you to all rise. And then think about where we come from. Think about our families. Think about those that have come before us. Think about those that are here. And think about where we are in our future and for those that are yet unborn. And that the work that we all do is connected. So in Hawaii, we have a deep, deep past of where we come from. And yet we have a deep unknown future of where we are yet to embark. And all of that is interconnected. So in that is a spirit and a realm that, as an indigenous Hawaiian, and most indigenous people understand that there is a connection of the spirit that ties us all together. So in today's honoring of those who have done work in our past, and those that have yet to do work, and those that are doing work in our present. So I'd like to begin by calling and opening this session. Ua au no veo ula kapua o ke a ali'i. Ho lena ha lena I ka vai Le ia o hukalu kalunu a o ke uki. Pu uki ka maka o ke ko o lau. Ku umau ho a kaya ulu o lalo O lalo ho o ki vai a ka nā ulu. I kahi mea iki huna makahuna. Me hai la I ka pili o hueva mai aloha mai aloha.
Thank you, Uncle Sol. And just before the session started, Uncle Sol said something to me that I think is really, really important. If we think about all of those lives, all those who have given their lives in the name of defending nature, and we imagine them in this space, in this room, it's a sad reality that they would probably fill the whole venue. And we're here today to try and take a tiny step forward to say enough. Not one more life, not one more family, not one more ancestor. No one needs to die in defense of nature. We should change whatever needs to change to address this. So in the panel today, we have a very great group of panelists who are going to share their perspective from where they're sitting about what they can do or what we can do collectively to change the course of the future, to make sure that no one loses their life in defense of nature. We first have Joan Carling here with us today. She's an amazing woman, an amazing activist, and one of the few, or many, I guess I should say now, Indigenous leaders who have fearlessly stood up to power and said, no more. This is not the way the world should work. And today she's going to share some of her thinking around environmental defenders, around the topic of conservation, around the topic of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Please, Joan, go ahead.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, okay. Yeah, good afternoon to everyone. As we are here discussing biodiversity conservation, we see thousands of our indigenous brothers and sisters facing threats because of conservation in their territory. We see this right now in the case of Tanzania, where more than 100,000 Maasai pastoralists are threatened with eviction for the protection, so-called protection of conservation areas. At the same time, we also see threats to those that are standing up against mining for transitional minerals in their areas in the name also of climate change. Other communities are also facing threats to eviction for renewable energy like dams and solar and windmills. That's the reality in many indigenous communities, and it's compounded by conflicts in certain areas where other armed groups are also interested in taking over the resources of indigenous peoples. We see this, for example, or involved into illegal activities like drugs. We see this in Colombia or in Mexico or in DRC, for example. So in my reflection, a lot of the indigenous peoples here in the COP15 have made sure all of us are saying that we need the protection of our rights. We need that states and other actors need to come to terms that we have rights over our lands and resources that are going to be used for conservation, and we need to be part of the decision. We need to be able to say no when fortress conservation is being imposed on us. We need to be able to practice our sustainable resource management systems that are also protecting, conserving the nature. And in this context, if that will not happen, then the threats of eviction is very real. And not only the threat of eviction, but when we take action against that imposition, we see a repetition of the killing, arrest, criminalization. That is the scenario. So for me, what is being discussed here is a matter of life and death for millions of indigenous peoples who are living in peace in their territories, but are being confronted with various interests, including conservation that is not recognizing our rights. So to conclude, I hope that the parties here, now that there is already the reference to the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples, free, prior, and informed consent, and based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that this will be transformed into clear actions on the ground in terms of policy, meaning policy coherence, that protection of indigenous peoples' rights comes before any mining law or any law on trade or even any law on conservation. We need policy coherence. That's one. We need a real program to support indigenous people's initiatives instead of accusing us as criminals. Support our initiatives for conservation, because and stop criminalizing our livelihoods. Because I'm telling you, thousands of indigenous peoples are in jail for simply doing their livelihood activities. In Nepal, for example, more than 13,000 are in jail for trespassing in national parks, trespassing, and they're still in jail. So we need to put a stop to this, that this should not anymore continue to happen, especially now that we are targeting more conservation areas. The very concept of national parks should be reoriented towards ensuring the protection of indigenous peoples and our ability to manage our resources. So for me, that is a very critical element that action on the ground is needed. And finally, when our rights are respected, then that will enable genuine partnership, because then we can be equal partners with others in forming, advancing common aspiration. Our aim in protecting biodiversity is to save humanity, right? And this should guide our action together on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. And I think there's really important reminders. I think maybe 30 or 40 years ago, people talked of environmental defenders and they imagined mining companies or extractives of some sort. But it's really sad that in the context of the CBD, we're having a conversation about environmental defenders in the context of conservation. Like, where have we gone wrong? That conservation is resulting in the loss of life, criminalization of people. You know, and so I think it's really important what you said, the ability to say no. The other day I heard something that really resounded with me, and they said, we shouldn't be asking Indigenous peoples for their consent. They should be coming to us for our consent. And that's absolutely right, you know. So I'd actually like to pass it to Milka. Milka's the coordinator for defending territories of life for the ICCA consortium, but she wears many hats as well, and she's also a young woman from Kenya who has had to deal with criminalization of all sorts. So Milka, I'd like you to share with us, in terms of some of what Joan said about, you know, how can we move things forward? From your experience on the ground, what do you see as the key issues or key wins that would really shift the tide on environmental defenders?
Thank you for having me, Amelia, and thank you for starting us off with that very great perspectives. And just what I would like to link on is just the, you know, the connection between what you're saying, that in the past, environmental defenders were seen maybe in the perspective of companies and extractives. And really to say that conservation projects and initiatives at the national level when it comes to Indigenous people is now an extractive form, because it is just continuing the same threats that companies, extractive companies were posing to communities. I say this reflecting back home. I am a forest Indigenous person. We live in the forest. There's no extractive happening in our forests. There's no road projects happening in our forest. There isn't, you know, the thing that you would say development of Kenya that is happening in our forest. But we are being threatened. We are being evicted from our land. We are losing our lands that, in a series that doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. So we lost our land to the colonial government in 1954 when they gazetted our land as a forest conservation, forest reserve. And so the tenure rights went with that. And then the independent government taking over that and continue with the same idea of, for conservation to happen, there shouldn't be people in it. What comes with that? Eviction. What comes with anybody that doesn't, that opposes that kind of the way of conservation? Threats, digital tracking, physical hurt to community leaders. And if we are talking of defenders, then Indigenous people, all of them collectively, are defenders of our territory. And every single person that has been evicted from our lands in the name of conservation, conservation without people, is an unaffected defender. And for us, the Sengwer people, I wouldn't say I'm a defender by myself. All of us from our land are defenders. And we've been affected by conservation strategies saying that we need to be out of our land for the government of Kenya to, unfortunately, come to report to these kind of processes and be like, we have protected this amount of land. And what protection means to them is to keep us out of our land. By all means, by shooting at us, by killing some of our community members. So you can't say that conservation projects now is not just like mining and oil extraction. It is the same, unfortunately. And that is why we say in the name of conservation, because it is not conservation. The thing that is happening in our territories also is that they keep us out of our territories so that they can be able to log our Indigenous trees. They just want less eyes or no eyes looking at what they do in our territories. And it is sad to say, yeah? And for those of us, the community leaders that, of course, come forward to talk against this, the threats are the same, like I said. And for women environmental defenders or for women Indigenous leaders who come out to speak against this, the unfortunate threat and reality that we face is sexism and sexual abuse, just so that you're silenced as a woman. Don't speak about this. And For a female, we all know that if your sexuality is tampered with, then you easily zip up. And that is happening to the female indigenous environmental defenders back, even in my community. Sometimes they even use our own community leaders or members to tame the female indigenous environmental defenders. I think the discussion that is not being, coming out in this kind of, talking about the framework going forward and the conservation agenda is the fact that this is just pure modern land grabbing. It is what it is, because if you're taking more land from communities for conservation reasons, land that has been taken before, and so the expansion is going on, just like what our sister shared about Tanzania, expansion of the territories or of the lands for conservation reasons, and communities are losing their lands, not to the colonial government, not to the conservation agencies, not to companies, and to everybody else. It is just a modern land grabbing, I would say. And what then we would like from these kind of discussions, informing policy and even to the national level, is that we undo the wrongs that we have done in the name of conservation. That we accept that the colonial system that came with fortress conservation led to the loss of land of indigenous people, and do that by giving the indigenous people their rights to their lands. They will conserve. It's not like we want our lands to destroy them. No, we have more connection on our land and our resources better than anybody else. We haven't just sat there with the trees and be like, we are chilling. No, we know that we need that tree for our water, for our medicine. And somebody else being given that, they will see it as money. And we want back our lands to take care of them. And if there is anything that needs to come out of these discussions, even to the national level, is to give back the land and give more land back to communities for conservation. It is not about taking the land from communities to put military systems into conserving environment. Because when you bring guns, uniforms, guards, you're just bringing continuing imbalance of power. And when you give someone a gun, you're giving them power to be like, you can shoot that guy if they cross here. What happens to livelihoods of communities? Unfortunately, Ami and my panelists here, I think this system is also just being used to, with time, kill indigenous people's livelihoods. Because if the livestock is crossing to Ngorongoro today, the community is being fined for having the livestock to graze on their own land. So with time, you find a herder who had 100 cattle selling one to release 99, and then they are recaptured, and then they sell another to release the 98. With time, this community's economic status is dying. So conservation is being used as a way to kill community survival and community existence through just doing away with our livelihoods every day. Because of why? In the name of conservation. So really, if there is anything that needs to come out of this, it is to undo everything that is happening, because the direction, the trajectory is not the right one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milka. Some very wise words indeed there. And it's really interesting, some of what you said, when we talk about conservation, one of the useful phrases we use at the ICCA consortium is to think about a conservation supply chain. So we deliver conservation as a product. And so our panel here is very interesting today because we have Ursula from the IUCN. And I think there is a definite shift, or at least I'm seeing a definite shift in conservation organizations like IUCN and other ones that are genuinely trying to change how conservation is happening on the ground. So just thinking a little bit about this, Ursula, in the context of the conservation supply chain, what do you see the role of conservation organizations in addressing some of what Joan and Milka have raised here, in undoing past wrongs, in not having conservation be like an extractive? and being able to engage and give back to communities. What do you think the role of conservation organizations is there?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a privilege and an honor and a challenge to have the word after these two amazing testimonies, you know, from really what is happening. And so I think that I cannot speak on behalf of all conservation international organizations. I work for IUCN, for our regional office in Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean, and it is one of the, if not the deadliest continent to be an environmental defender. So it is you know, a challenge, a privilege to be speaking here today. And I think all organizations, international organizations, you know, what we should do really is to have a reflection, like a deep reflection on what is our role that we are having in shaping negotiations, in shaping global frameworks, such as the one we are here at COP15. And IUCN, as a 70-year-old, 75-now-year-old organization, we have come a long way, I think, in this reflection. And these spaces, I think, are encouraging when we reflect about what things have to be undone, you know, so that we can move forward. So IUCN's mission, and I think, you know, our organizations should really reflect on our mission. Is our mission still relevant? You know, is our mission addressing, embedding the awful things that have been done in the name of conservation? So IUCN's mission is to influence societies around the globe, you know, for natural resources use in an equitable and sustainable manner. So equitable means that the human rights approach has to be part of the conservation. So that is one thing that as a union, the Secretariat, our members, we have state members in IUCN, most of them, all of our members are parties in the COP15, and our commissions that are hosting such events as this one. And IUCN has come since 1964 with more than 100 resolutions, either in defense or in you know, strong statements for the defense of indigenous peoples and local communities. So one thing that our union is doing is to provide safe spaces for civil participation. I think we have the moral imperative to amplify the voices of those vulnerable communities that are being, you know, that are suffering these human rights violations. And what we heard now, and I think that is target 2 or 3, I'm not an expert now in the 20-something targets that are being negotiated, the 30 by 30 target, there are, you know, true preoccupations, you know, about the implications of meeting this target, this new ambition, if it is not going to be done with a human rights approach. And we certainly had a recent discussion with the UN Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples and Indigenous People Organization members of IUCN to really reflect on this and what are those safeguards that need to be guaranteed, you know, when we talk about implementation. And I also think that we need to speak about finance, you know, and the role of our organization in mainstreaming, you know, in the implementation. All these pledges, I just heard from the chat of IUCN that there's $1 billion, you know, being pledged for conservation. That is good, it's a good ambition, but how is it going to be, you know, implemented on the ground? And I think that is where organizations that we are agencies for the JEF, for the GCF, and all these multilateral finance mechanisms need to be also reflecting about what it means nature positive. It has to be people positive first and foremost. And nature-based solution cannot be a solution if it's not a people-based solution. And I think these are the discussions that we need to amplify and we need to back up as international organizations. And then I also want to say that our role as conservation organizations at the project level, you know, we are agencies that we either implement, execute projects through partners, and it's of course an opportunity, but of course there is also a risk. And now, you know, we have the environmental and social safeguards, but it has to be more than just ticking a box when you are designing a project, right? From the safety of the capitals. Some of these plans are not made in a participatory manner. They are not context specific to really address what is happening on the ground, and it cannot be just a copy-paste from. So we need to be very honest about how these safeguards are happening, whether funds are being devoted to really monitor the implementation of these safeguards, and we have seen examples of projects financed by multilateral organizations that are actually exacerbating human rights violations. So that is a huge challenge that we need to be addressing. And also, I think it was mentioned by my predecessors that not all environmental defenders have one reality. We also have to think about women defenders, you know, in the context of Latin America and Africa, it's in Asia, it's very relevant, and we need to then have a very context-specific response to these threats. And then I would like to finalize saying that we need to work with the communities, with environmental defenders to empower them. In the previous panel, they were saying about it's about attitude, it's about changing the attitude. We are not talking about beneficiaries, recipients, we're talking about people who have been there and who will be there after a certain project ends and after a government is re-elected. So empowerment means talking and partnering with environmental defenders to make sure that we as a community build with them the tools that are necessary. We build the evidence. I think that's another piece that needs to be strengthened, the evidence. You know, we know that there are human rights violations, but we need to have these interconnections between gender-based violence, Jackie has done a great job about that, and environmental degradation. We need to equip local communities, environmental defenders with these tools so that we can go from the theory and from the speech to the practice. Yes, I think I will stop with that. Maybe we can have a follow-up. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Ursula. It's so refreshing to hear someone from a big organization saying we need to have a reflection and think about whether we're relevant. Because I think you're absolutely right. So much of what you raised is so important. You know, it's not just about having the right safeguards. It's about making sure that they're implemented and they're actually followed through. It's about empowering those who are on the ground doing conservation day in and day out. Another thing that really resonates is this issue about money, that whether we want to or not, money matters. And so how do we align with funders, with those who have money, whether they're government funders, multilateral funds, philanthropists, those who have the money, to put the necessary pressures on their funding so that those who are doing the implementing, like big conservation organizations, have to abide by certain rules and standards. So we're really super lucky to have Jessica here with us today from Synchronicity Earth. This is one of the funders who is actually every day doing things differently. So Jessica, I wonder if you can share, based on this very hard path you've had to walk, in terms of doing things differently, how do we get the money to do things differently for defenders on the ground?
Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor, and I've been here all morning because I felt like I needed to come and deep dive into this space so that I could really respond to this panel and to all of you appropriately. And I think that's because we are doing it differently, and so I have to step outside of myself in order to really understand what the problems are. And I know that the problems exist because I am in the space, but I kind of just don't accept that the space has to be operating that way. And I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been listening to all of you and to the previous panels is that this notion of philanthropy, I mean, if you really take it back to the root words of what it's supposed to be a love for humans. And here we are sitting in this space, and we're entirely, we're being reminded to consider the humanity of what we are actually trying to achieve and how we're going to do that together. So You know, Kristen Walker, who's been present in a lot of these conversations, has been asking us all to reimagine everything. And I think, you know, for me, there's simply no way of addressing any of this without placing front and center as a funder the question of what are we actually asking? What are we actually trying to do? And how is that relevant or not relevant to the space that we want to be working within? And so as a funder and also as an NGO, so Synchronicity Earth is a charity based in the UK, you know, my philanthropy funds the operational expenses of that organization, and then the work that we do goes out to the world to support local communities, indigenous people, to do what they would like to be doing, to do the work that they would like to be leading on. And we take the onus and the burden of all of the complexities around the structures of reporting and how we're going to create those relationships and think about alleviating those obstacles to make it as easy as possible to get funding into the hands. I mean, the question we asked when we first started was, how can we support underfunded species and ecosystems? We had no idea at the time when we asked that question that we were going to be working with so many exceptional human beings who are meant to be leading on all of this work. And so whether we're looking at the protection of nature, the protection of the land, or we're looking at the protection of the people within in those landscapes in order to do their job, it's not about the funder. It's about how do we support you to be who you are, to just actually be the person that you are designed to be within the context and the space that you live and occupy and understand far better than anyone else stepping into those territories. So for me, it's about funders stepping outside of their ego, outside of their frameworks, outside of their structures, outside of their ideologies, and thinking about what are we really trying to do here? What is our presence here? How can we use that well? How do we take advice? We've heard a lot about listening. We've heard a lot about relationships. Those are all absolutely essential, like non-negotiable criteria for the work that funders have to do. And I just think there's something very interesting about addressing the consciousness. And, you know, we've talked about the IUCN, we've talked about the CBD in and of itself, the fact that it exists, the need for it to exist. But the consciousness that created these structures, that then created these implementing frameworks for fortress conservation, is really the consciousness that we need to be undoing. And that consciousness is not one thing. It's a multitude of consciousnesses. There's a diversity to approaches that need to be celebrated. And they're context specific. Yes, of course, there are similarities across different spaces and places. But there's such diversity of approaches and of implementing, of thinking through things, of time and the length that we need to apply in terms of getting to, when we're granting, how long things might take. We just need to bend all the rules and remember that we've created all of the rules, and actually they're all really, we can undo all of them if we want to, but we have to get to a much more inclusive approach of acting and remember our humanity, and I think bring our heart into this as Saul did, you know, which brings the emotion. And for me, that's what philanthropy is. It's an emotional process. This is not meant to be like, here's my money, go and do this. You know, like, this is actually engaging at a level that I don't think we even are, like, we're barely scratching the surface of the heart that needs to be involved in these conversations. I mean, I can talk more about, but I did want to just say that with regard to environmental defenders, I mean, there's so much that we can do as funders to support the threats that come up and crop up immediately, and, you know, create and funds and structures that are responsive and immediate and, you know, look at when we're working with indigenous communities, local communities on the ground, start to think up front as much as we possibly can about what kinds of safeguards they might need, what possible issues might emerge, and then how as funders we can already be thinking in advance, not that we would like we want any of these things to happen, but there might very well be times when we're going to have to mobilize funding much more quickly, and that can happen. There's no way that foundations can tell me in this day and age that they can't mobilize funding quickly. Private philanthropy is different to government, yes, but we can do that. That's something we can do, and we need to do more of that. I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. And I think this is essential, especially right now where we're coming together in a forum that's trying to homogenize everything, reminding ourselves that we have to look at a diversity of solutions. And we have to work on building relationships with our heart, both with the land and those who are defending it, is essential. So thank you very much for reminding of that, Jessica. And I think we've been working at IUCN through the commissions, through the secretariat, through the members, on trying to see how we can influence this process that we're in that seems so abstract in so many ways. And we've put together a very brief suggested text, very specific, because we do need to ground it on where we're here now. How do we take this forward? In the context of the negotiations, how do we take this forward? What would a post-2020 global biodiversity framework look like that would really shift the tide on environmental defenders? And so I'd like to pass it to Jackie from IUCN, who will introduce to us or share with us some of the key highlights that are coming out of this suggested brief specific toward the post-2020 framework. Please, Jackie.
Thank Ame, and I would like to tell to the people of the audience that we produce a QR code card. So if you want to know more about the brief, you just download it. We have a couple of cards here, so we can share it at the end of the presentation. So in the brief, we say that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework aims to catalyze urgent and transformative action to live in harmony with nature, including by taking a whole society approach. So environmental human rights defenders are agents of change who are at the front line of the protection of nature, and we need to protect them. In the brief, we call to the Global Biodiversity Framework to include measures to recognize, to support, and to ensure the safety of environmental defenders. We also tell that the implementation should follow the human rights approach, and that the human right, such as having a clean and healthy environmental, should be an overarching cross-cutting principle of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We also need to include it in the monitoring framework, because we need to ensure its implementation. We also propose in the brief that the Global Biodiversity Framework should explicitly commit parties and improve the safety of environmental human defenders. Here, they must have access to justice. They have to have an effective and timely remedies for the cases with indigenous people we just heard that are in jail. So we need to help them. And we need for that to support Target 21. And Target 21 should therefore ensure the protection and access to the justice of environmental human rights defenders. And if we have this target, we also need indicators. And these indicators need to first measure the safety, then measure the improvement and protection, and also measure the access to justice. And in the document, you will see that we had included several indicators that can guide this measure. Today, we have around the world more than 156 countries that include in their constitutions or national regulations the right to have a clean and healthy environment. The recognition of this, the implementation of this right in the Global Biodiversity Framework expands, we think it expands the opportunities of the environmental human rights defenders in terms of advocacy, legal claims, but also governments and business accountable for the actions toward the environment. For this reason, we suggest that in the BV's section, this right is a principle, and also that the implementation of the framework fully respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, including the right of a safe, clean, and healthy environment, and as an international human rights law. In relation to the accountability of business and financial institutions, and specifically in Target 15, we want to make mandatory the assessment and disclosure of impact, not only biodiversity, but also in human rights. And, but we also need, in this target, that government need to establish legal and administrative and policy measures that ensure that business and financial institutions really are responsible for and accountable for the impacts of the activities that they finance. In addition, another aspect is the secure of land rights, including the customary and collective land rights of indigenous peoples' communities. And this is fundamental for environmental human rights defenders, because they are defending their territories, so they need to have the right to their lands. And at the same time, we think that in Target 21, this respect to right to indigenous people and communities over their lands has to be there. And also, this is something that has to be taken in target and considered in target number 2 and 3, as Ursula was mentioning. Finally, something that has been mentioned is the issue of how women environmental defenders are facing gender-based violence. So the agency of women environmental defenders is often blocked by the lack of rights over the lands, the resources, the lack of representation, the decision-making, and the lack of access to funding. So we think that we need a target to approve Target 22 for that. So this is the main ideas. However, at the end of the brief, we have a series of resources that you can access to have more information about this topic. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Jackie. And oftentimes, you know, the nitty-gritty of the negotiations are really complicated to manage. But I think you've done a stellar job in presenting some of the key recommendations of how we can, in this space, influence governments to try and do things differently, especially in the implementation of the Post-2020 framework. So we do have a couple of minutes. I'd like to open the floor. We have this amazing, powerful panel of women up here, and I'm wondering, I know there's probably very many defenders. I see Joseph there, other Ramson there. There are other defenders in the audience, as well as allies of those defenders. And so if anybody would like to ask a question or share a reflection, we do have a couple of minutes, not a huge amount of time, but I would like to invite you all to make a comment. And if there's not, I have lots of comments. Joseph, Joseph, can you intervene in English? Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. That is a quiz, I think. Thank you very much for all presentation. And I have some recommendation. The first one is I congratulate all presentation, And I saw that we are here to adopt the global framework. So I am Francophone, and please take me. The first one recommendation is how IUCN, I see conservation, I see synchronicity, how you can help us to change something in the national level. Because you help us with inclusive conservation. That is a big project. How you can now promote the equity in conservation. And you have partners with some states. You have influence to state. How you can help us to influence some law, conservation law in national level, because all things that my sister say, Milka, it is in the law. We have the law of conservation that give power to some eco guards to take guns and to protect the area with the gun. That is the law. We must now change the law. You can help us also to change the law of conservation. That is the first recommendation in the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. That is the first one. The other thing is when indigenous people has defend the nature, it's not for our benefit, because it is for humanity. We are fighting to save nature, is for identity, but the benefit is for all. Why we must be a victim for defending that thing which is for all people? Because nature cannot defend themselves. It's the people who can defend nature. How you can now link with us to defend and to change the law for the defending person who defends the nature. That is the other thing I want to add, but I congratulate. It is a big issue for implementation of global framework for biodiversity, because that is a big challenge. We can have the good decision here, but in the step of implementation, that is an issue. And we want some support for partners, because I need IUCN. You have guidelines for the different category of protected area. And you know that we have the 6th category for community conservation. How you can now help us in implementing of global framework, biodiversity framework, to promote the conservation by community. Thank you. Sorry for my bad English.
Your English is perfect, Joseph, and your questions are even more so. I think he raises some really good ones. I love that, funding for humanity, not for the community itself, but for a bigger purpose. Would anybody like to take some time to respond to some of Joseph's reflections? Anyone from our panel? Jackie?
Maybe I can start, and maybe Ursula can complement. Thanks for your question. It's a challenge when we try to implement. We take this global framework, and then we have to take it with us to our countries and try to make it a reality. And this is what things get really hard. But from the point of view of, for example, I can talk from the point of view of my team, which is the Human Rights and Conservation team of IUCN. We have been really working together with our members, our country members, to start, changing and advocating for change that promote the inclusion of human rights on their environmental laws. We know that this is a process, and it is a process that takes a lot of capacity building, because we need to sensitize and develop the capacity of the people and the government. So this is another part that we can contribute. And one of the most important things that we can also contribute as an IUCN is that we are able to open spaces for talking in the same level. So this is something that we can do and support. And of course, we make and have a lot of projects on the field. And these projects also helps to change policies and to build evidence that can make decision makers change their mind. So this is what I can say from my point of view.
Thank you. Maybe to complement a bit, in Latin America, where I work, what we find is that it's not that there are not enough laws. You know, in paper, there is a framework to protect. It's about implementation, and it's about access to justice. And in many times, also the low capacity from the institutions, from prosecutors, even to identify the crimes, and local communities and indigenous peoples having really access, not having access, or finding barriers to access, even if it's a language, if it's only Spanish. So with IUCN and with funders such as the Swedish government, we are launching now a project that it's gonna be tackling the gaps between, you know, the frameworks and the laws, but the actual implementation. That is just one example. Even trying to identify the threats, you know, before actually the crime or the harm happens. How can you, before that happens, have precautionary approaches to safeguard the integrity? And we know there is a very rich network of partners that work on these emergency funds to actually, before the crime, before the harm happens, to help safeguard the physical integrity of defenders. And then I think on the other questions that you raised, it's about you know, going beyond the 30 by 30 target, you know, the 6 categories that IUCN established some decades ago. And now we really, I think, need to push the concept of OECMs, the other conservation areas. Well, I don't remember the full name, but you know what I'm saying. No, so it's beyond the state controlled, but it's about community-led, community-based management, where I think we can have to start a constructive dialogue about meeting the 30 by 30 with the OECMs. And IUCN is doing so great work on that. My colleagues, thank you.
Milka, go ahead. Joan and Milka, no, just Milka? And then we're gonna have to close very soon.
Okay, sorry. That is a question that sounded like it went to the conservation organizations and NGOs, but I have a suggestion, of course, based on the experiences that myself, my community, and other communities have had with conservation organizations, and based on that history and experience, the suggestion would be that that conservation organizations, IUCN, WWF, and others, if they are in the room, to tame their hunger of giving out funds to governments and think about what this funding is doing on the ground. If it means changing the how do we call them, the guidelines to support community-led conservation rather than just pumping money to governments for conservation when it is not being used in the right way. Being bold enough to just say that this government, we have money for you, or we have money for conservation, but only if it supports community-based conservation and does not continue with the conservation as extractive. If that is done, especially by the huge, big conservation NGOs, then governments will listen, because the reality is that, especially governments in Africa, they don't have funding on their own budgets much towards environmental conservation. Most of the funding come from outside. How about this outside informing themselves and working together to want to change issues within the governments? Because otherwise you're leaving us as communities in the hands of very brutal governments who will come to us and beat us to fulfill a conservation target or whatever at the global level. Yeah.
If you do you have some very last comments?
Yes, if I can.
Just
No,
very briefly.
Can I be heard? No, I think we did not touch also on the issue of addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss, because that's actually where we have a lot of environment defenders, because they're protecting the environment from the destruction of other extractive industry, agribusiness, and all of this. So we need to put that in the equation, because the situation we're looking at now is that the devastation done, the biodiversity loss is because of this kind of extractive industries. And now that the remaining biodiversity are in the territories of indigenous peoples, because we protected them, they're coming in now in the name of conservation to drive us out again. So we're driven out already from the destroyed biodiversity, and the ones that we are protecting will drive us out again. Then where do we go? That's the equation. So we need to address the drivers of biodiversity loss and effectively partner with indigenous peoples on how to protect the remaining biodiversity based on the respect for our rights. I think that's the option that we have. And I hope that the states would look at this and say, this is the right way to go. Thank you.
Absolutely, Joan, and I think that is absolutely right. This drivers of biodiversity loss is key. And I know we're out of time, but in the spirit of how Sol started our session, I'd like everyone to stand up, and we're going to hold a moment of silence. And this is a moment of silence to honor the defenders, but also a moment for you to reflect from where you're standing, from who you are, from what you do every day. What can you do to change the course of conservation, to change the drivers of biodiversity loss, and to stand with defenders? So just a moment of silence and reflect on that before we all go our own ways. Thank you to our panel. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you for what you will do, leaving here, to change for environmental defenders. Thank you, everyone.